Hey guys, tonight we step into the loud, chaotic, wine-soaked world of ancient Rome, a civilization that conquered half the known world and then immediately asked, all right, but what are we doing this afternoon? So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If there was one thing ancient Romans truly feared, it was boredom. Second thing they feared was losing money gambling. Naturally, they dealt with both problems at the exact same time. Gambling in ancient Rome was everywhere. Dice clattered across tavern tables, soldiers gambled inside military camps, merchants placed bets in crowded alleyways, and wealthy aristocrats quietly destroyed their finances behind the elegant walls of luxurious villas while pretending they were men of discipline and reason, which is adorable in hindsight. Officially, gambling laws existed. Unofficially, Romans treated those laws the same way modern people treat "I have read and agree to the terms and conditions." Technically acknowledged, spiritually ignored. The most common games involved dice, small cubes carved from bone, ivory, or wood rolled endlessly across tables, while men shouted accusations, prayed to the gods, and insisted they were just one throw away from recovering catastrophic losses. This sentence has survived history almost untouched. Poor Romans gambled small amounts, maybe a few coins, food, or cheap clothing. Rich Romans, however, approached gambling with the emotional restraint of raccoons discovering fermented fruit. Some lost horses, jewelry, property, furniture, or entire estates. Imagine being a Roman wife and hearing your husband calmly explain that the family vineyard now belongs to a man named Gaius because of an unfortunate dice situation. And naturally, cheating was everywhere. Loaded dice became such a problem that Roman writers constantly complained about dishonest gamblers. Taverns were full of suspiciously lucky men who somehow won every third game while smiling like absolute villains from a stage play. Even emperors became addicted. Claudius loved gambling so much that he reportedly had a custom dice board installed inside his carriage. Rome built roads stretching across continents, connected distant provinces, and mastered engineering on a breathtaking scale. Also, the emperor could continue losing money while traveling. A civilization truly committed to efficiency. Most gambling happened inside taverns. Dark, smoky places overflowing with wine fumes, arguments, shouting, and at least one man insisting the gods were personally sabotaging him. Fights broke out constantly. A bad dice roll could end friendships, marriages, or occasionally someone's ability to chew solid food. Romans also believed luck itself moved between people like a wandering spirit, which meant if you kept losing, it was clearly not your fault. It was destiny, or Mercury, or bad dice, or the loud man coughing beside you. Literally anything except your terrible decision-making. And despite losing fortunes over and over again, Romans kept gambling endlessly, because in ancient Rome, boredom lasted an afternoon. But debt could survive long enough to disappoint your grandchildren too. If gambling emptied a Roman's wallet, the bathhouse helped them emotionally recover from the experience, while simultaneously hearing 30 new rumours and catching 3 different skin diseases. The public baths of Rome were not peaceful wellness spas filled with cucumber water and soft flute music. They were gigantic social arenas where thousands of sweaty Romans gathered daily to relax, gossip, argue, flirt, network, and occasionally remember to bathe somewhere between political debates and screaming matches. For many Romans, especially those living in cramped apartment blocks called insulae, the baths were an escape from home life. Their apartments were often hot, crowded, noisy, and smelled like smoke mixed with old cabbage and human disappointment. So naturally, everyone rushed toward another loud, overcrowded building full of naked strangers. Civilization was advancing beautifully. A typical Roman bathhouse included changing rooms, exercise courts, hot baths, warm baths, cold plunge pools, gardens, libraries, and lounges. Wealthy Romans arrived surrounded by servants carrying towels, oils, perfumes, and sandals. Poor citizens stood beside them using the exact same water, which sounds strangely equal until you remember the rich men still spent the entire afternoon loudly reminding everyone they were rich. Bathhouse conversations could range from politics to business deals to deeply unnecessary gossip. Senators discussed state affairs while floating in steaming pools beside merchants, labourers, gamblers, and at least one drunk man aggressively explaining horse racing statistics nobody asked for. Roman writers constantly complained about the noise. One philosopher described hearing grunting athletes, splashing water, shouting vendors, singing, slapping massagers, and men arguing endlessly about exercise techniques. Imagine trying to relax in a sauna while someone nearby screams about olive prices and another man recites poetry no human requested. The bathing process itself was also strange by modern standards. Romans covered their skin in olive oil, exercised until sweaty, then scraped dirt and oil away using curved metal tools called strigils. Essentially, humans turned themselves into greasy roast chickens before scraping off the seasoning. Food vendors wandered through the baths selling snacks and drinks. Massage attendants offered services. Gamblers played dice in corners despite gambling laws. Some people spent entire afternoons there doing absolutely nothing productive whatsoever, which, to be fair, remains one of humanity's favourite hobbies. And perhaps most importantly, the baths cured boredom. In Rome, entertainment did not require a stage or an arena. Sometimes all you needed was hot water, wine, gossip, and the possibility of overhearing a senator accidentally ruin his own political career while sitting completely naked beside a fish merchant. Romans loved pets, not in the modern, here is a small dog wearing a birthday hat kind of way. Although, honestly, they probably would have embraced that too. Roman elites treated exotic animals as living status symbols, conversation starters, and solutions to boredom severe enough to make someone import a peacock from another continent purely for decoration. Wealthy households across Rome filled their villas with unusual pets. Parrots, ravens, magpies, monkeys, snakes, tiny lapdogs, and brightly coloured birds all appeared inside aristocratic homes. Some rich Romans even kept small deer or exotic cats wandering around their gardens, simply because ordinary pets no longer impressed anyone after your neighbour bought his fourth peacock. Talking birds became especially fashionable. Parrots and ravens were trained to repeat greetings, phrases, or insults in Latin. Roman writers describe birds greeting visitors, praising emperors, or repeating phrases endlessly throughout the house. Imagine spending enormous sums of money importing an exotic bird, only for it to spend the next 10 years screaming the Roman equivalent of "Good morning, idiot" at dinner guests. Certain birds became famous for their intelligence. One story tells of a raven trained to greet Emperor Augustus personally. Another bird supposedly memorized entire phrases after hearing them repeatedly in public markets, which means ancient Rome accidentally invented the emotionally exhausting talking pet owner 2,000 years early. Dogs were also extremely popular. Small lapdogs sat beside wealthy women during banquets, while larger dogs guarded homes and workshops. Romans even placed warning mosaics near entrances reading "Beware of the dog." Humanity has apparently refused to improve front door humour since antiquity, but the truly wealthy Romans pushed pet ownership into complete absurdity. Some built private ponds for exotic fish and eels, others hired servants, whose entire job involved caring for animals. One Roman aristocrat reportedly cried publicly after the death of a beloved pet eel. Not a horse, not a loyal hunting dog. An eel! Somewhere in the empire, hardened legionaries guarded distant frontiers while a senator held a funeral for slippery spaghetti with a face. Pets also became entertainment during dinner parties. Guests admired rare animals while servants carried them around villas like living luxury decorations. Exotic birds chirped from golden cages while peacocks strutted through gardens trying desperately to look important. Which, to be fair, mirrors most Roman aristocrats perfectly. For Romans, animals distracted from boredom while displaying wealth at the same time. Because in ancient Rome, owning a normal pet was never enough if you could instead emotionally bond with a highly expensive bird that insulted your guests in Latin. For wealthy Romans, boredom often ended the same way. Lying sideways on a couch at a dinner party, while consuming dangerous amounts of wine and pretending to enjoy a senator's poetry recital. Roman banquets were not simple meals. They were theatrical performances designed to impress guests, display wealth, crush rivals emotionally, and occasionally destroy someone's digestive system beyond recovery. A rich Roman host was not merely feeding people. He was announcing to society, "Observe how absurdly successful I am." Inside lavish villas across Rome, guests reclined on cushioned couches arranged around low tables, while servants carried endless waves of food into the dining room. Romans usually ate lying partially sideways, which modern doctors would probably describe as an exciting new choking technique. The meals could last for hours. First came eggs, salads, seafood and fruit. Then arrived roasted meats, exotic birds, sausages, oysters, fish drenched in garum sauce, and expensive delicacies imported from distant provinces. Wealthy Romans became obsessed with serving rare foods, simply because ordinary meals no longer stimulated them emotionally. One host might serve flamingo tongues. Another offered dormice stuffed with herbs. Imagine attending a luxurious banquet only to discover the evening's special dish is essentially seasoned attic squirrel. And of course there was wine. Massive amounts of wine. Romans usually diluted it with water, because drinking pure wine was considered uncivilized behavior, which is remarkable considering the same civilization regularly packed arenas to watch gladiators stab each other for public amusement. Apparently Rome had standards. Very confusing standards, but standards nonetheless. Entertainment flowed constantly during these banquets. Musicians played softly in the background. Dancers performed between courses. Acrobats flipped across the room while drunk guests applauded far too enthusiastically. Some hosts hired actors, comedians, or exotic animal handlers purely to keep guests entertained during meals. Conversation also became competitive. Guests debated politics, philosophy, military campaigns, and gossip, while trying desperately to appear intelligent. Certain Romans even forced everyone to listen to terrible poetry they had personally written. Ancient writers complained endlessly about surviving these literary ambushes. Imagine trying to enjoy roasted pheasant, while a wealthy aristocrat recites 40 lines comparing himself to Hercules. Some banquets grew so excessive that guests intentionally vomited during meals so they could continue eating afterward. Contrary to popular myth, Romans did not have special vomit rooms, but they absolutely embraced the horrifying spirit of the concept anyway. For Roman elites, dinner parties cured boredom through spectacle, food, wine, gossip, and endless social competition. Because in ancient Rome, even relaxing required emotional warfare, public performance, and at least one deeply questionable seafood dish nobody truly wanted to eat. If you wandered through the streets of Rome hoping for peace and quiet, you had misunderstood Rome completely. The city was loud, crowded, chaotic, and overflowing with entertainers desperately competing for attention, like the ancient version of social media creators fighting over an algorithm. Street entertainment existed everywhere. Public squares, markets, temples, alleys, and forums constantly buzzed with musicians, actors, dancers, magicians, jugglers, acrobats, storytellers, and comedians. A Roman citizen could barely walk 10 minutes without encountering someone swallowing fire, insulting politicians, or trying to balance a monkey on their shoulder for money. For ordinary Romans, these performers offered free entertainment in a world without television, radio, or internet. If you wanted excitement after work, you simply walked into the street and waited 5 minutes. Something ridiculous would inevitably happen, usually involving yelling. Jugglers tossed knives, balls, or flaming torches before noisy crowds. Acrobats performed flips in busy marketplaces while musicians played drums and flutes nearby. Snake charmers carried exotic animals gathered from distant provinces, terrifying children and deeply annoying nearby merchants trying to sell cabbage in peace. Actors performed short comedy scenes based on everyday Roman life. Many involved cheating husbands, lazy servants, arrogant rich men, or fools being publicly humiliated. Roman humour was surprisingly familiar. Humanity apparently discovered laughing at embarrassing idiots very early and simply never moved on creatively. Street comedians also mocked politicians openly. This was dangerous but popular. Crowds loved hearing performers insult corrupt officials or imitate famous public figures dramatically. Imagine a Roman senator walking through the market only to hear a comedian doing a painfully accurate impression of his terrible speeches beside a fish stall. Animal acts became especially popular. Trainers brought monkeys, bears, birds, and trained dogs into public spaces. Certain performers taught animals tricks, while others staged bizarre miniature battles between creatures for entertainment. Somewhere in Rome, a man probably spent years training a goat for theatrical purposes, while philosophers debated the nature of existence nearby. Ancient civilization truly contained multitudes. The crowds themselves added to the madness. Spectators shouted encouragement, laughed loudly, argued with performers, and occasionally started fights. Pickpockets moved through dense audiences stealing purses, while distracted Romans watched jugglers nearly set themselves on fire. Public entertainment and petty crime formed one of Rome's most stable partnerships. Street performers often relied entirely on audience donations, meaning the louder and stranger the act became, the more money they earned. Naturally, Roman entertainment gradually evolved toward complete chaos, because in ancient Rome, boredom rarely survived for long. Somewhere nearby, a comedian was insulting a senator, a monkey was stealing fruit from a vendor, and a crowd of citizens was gathering enthusiastically to watch the situation spiral into absolute disaster. Romans loved poetry, or at least they loved the idea of being seen as people who loved poetry. These were not always the same thing. In wealthy Roman society, writing poetry became one of the most popular ways to fight boredom and inflate your ego simultaneously. Aristocrats across Rome spent hours crafting dramatic verses about love, war, mythology, politics, nature, or occasionally themselves, which was usually the subject they found most inspiring. The problem was that many Roman elites believed they were brilliant poets, simply because nobody around them was socially allowed to tell them otherwise. At dinner parties and social gatherings, guests were often trapped listening to endless poetry recitals, hosted by wealthy men desperate for admiration. Ancient Roman writers complained constantly about this cultural plague. Some described avoiding certain streets entirely because they feared being dragged into another poetry reading by an overly enthusiastic senator clutching a scroll. Imagine innocently attending a banquet for free food and wine, only for your host to suddenly announce, "Friends, I have written a modest 80-line poem comparing my military achievements to Jupiter himself." At that point, even barbarian invasions probably started looking convenient. Certain recitals lasted for hours. Guests reclined awkwardly on couches, while the poet performed dramatic readings filled with exaggerated emotion and painfully long metaphors. Audience members were expected to applaud politely, no matter how terrible the poem actually was. Roman society functioned partly through mutual emotional hostage situations. Professional poets existed too, and some became genuinely famous. Writers like Virgil and Ovid attracted huge audiences. Public readings could draw crowds eager to hear stories about heroes, gods, romance, or scandal. But for every talented poet, there were thousands of wealthy Romans producing literary disasters with tremendous confidence. Poetry also became competitive. Rich citizens tried to outdo one another with clever wordplay, emotional speeches, or dramatic performances. Some practiced endlessly beforehand. Others improvised while drunk, which almost never improved the final result despite what they firmly believed. Even emperors joined in. Emperor Nero famously performed poetry and music publicly, while audiences sat through the experience with the careful enthusiasm of people who understood execution was technically still an option. Ancient historians claimed some audience members secretly pretended to faint or even fake illnesses just to escape his performances, and yet Romans genuinely adored these events. Poetry transformed boredom into spectacle, gossip, competition, and social theatre. Because in ancient Rome, entertainment did not always require gladiators or chariot races. Sometimes all it required was one extremely confident aristocrat, several gallons of wine, and an audience physically incapable of leaving politely. Roman weddings were supposed to celebrate love, family, and the sacred joining of two households. Naturally, Romans transformed them into loud public spectacles filled with drunken singing, strange rituals, aggressive jokes, and enough social pressure to emotionally flatten the average human being. For ordinary citizens and wealthy elites alike, weddings became one of the biggest opportunities to kill boredom. Entire neighborhoods gathered to watch ceremonies unfold in the streets of Rome, because Romans treated private events the same way modern people treat celebrity scandals. If something dramatic was happening nearby, everyone wanted front row seats. The day usually began with the bride dressing in elaborate clothing, including a bright veil and carefully arranged hairstyle held together with ribbons. Roman writers loved describing brides as symbols of dignity and purity, which is slightly ironic considering the absolute chaos waiting for them outside the house. Once the ceremony ended, the real entertainment began. Guests feasted, drank wine, sang songs, and shouted jokes at the newly married couple. Roman wedding humour was often crude, loud, and astonishingly public. Friends and relatives openly teased the groom about married life, while musicians and dancers turned the streets into a moving celebration. One popular tradition involved throwing walnuts to children during the wedding procession. Walnuts symbolised leaving childhood behind, although from the perspective of nearby pedestrians, it probably looked like rich Romans had suddenly decided to weaponize snacks against the youth population. The procession itself became a giant public parade. Guests carried torches through the streets while shouting songs and jokes loudly enough for half the city to hear. Crowds gathered to watch, gossip, or simply enjoy the spectacle. Somewhere nearby, a man trying to sleep before work was learning every detail about strangers' marriage against his will. Roman wedding songs could also become deeply embarrassing. Certain traditional chants mocked the couple openly or made suggestive jokes about the wedding night. Imagine beginning your married life while relatives scream awkward songs outside your house surrounded by cheering neighbours. Truly a beautiful sacred ritual. At wealthy weddings, the celebrations became even more extravagant. Banquets stretched for hours with musicians, dancers, acrobats, exotic foods, and endless wine. Rich hosts viewed weddings as opportunities to display status and impress rivals. The marriage itself occasionally felt secondary to proving you could afford 17 peacocks and imported oysters simultaneously. Of course, drinking often pushed celebrations into complete disorder. Arguments broke out. Guests became emotional. Musicians played terribly by the end of the night. At least one relative almost certainly cried dramatically in a corner, while another tried explaining politics to a decorative statue. For Romans, weddings cured boredom through spectacle, gossip, music, drinking, and shared public chaos. Because in ancient Rome, even sacred ceremonies eventually transformed into neighborhood entertainment, featuring flying walnuts and socially mandatory humiliation. At some point in Roman history, wealthy citizens collectively looked at ordinary hobbies and decided they were no longer dramatic enough. Gambling? Too common. Poetry? Exhausting. Public baths? Predictable. So naturally, many rich Romans developed intense emotional relationships with exotic fish. Across luxurious villas in Rome, aristocrats built elaborate private fish ponds, filled with rare species imported from distant parts of the empire. These ponds were not practical food supplies for emergencies. They were luxury entertainment projects, designed purely to impress guests and satisfy the Roman elite's endless hunger for strange distractions. Some fish ponds were enormous. Wealthy landowners spent fortunes constructing artificial pools connected to the sea, so fresh salt water could circulate naturally. Servants maintained the ponds daily, while owners proudly showed visitors their expensive marine collections as if introducing distinguished senators. Roman writers mocked this obsession constantly. One author joked that certain nobles cared more about their fish than their families, which, judging by some surviving stories, may not have been entirely unfair. The most famous examples involved moray eels. Rich Romans became fascinated by them. These long, sharp-toothed sea creatures lurked inside decorative pools, where guests could admire them during banquets. Imagine arriving at a luxurious villa, hoping for wine and conversation, only to discover your host desperately wants you to compliment his terrifying water snake collection. One Roman noble reportedly fed his favourite eel by hand and decorated it with jewellery. Another allegedly burst into tears after an eel died. Somewhere beyond the borders of the empire, hardened Roman legionaries stood freezing in distant forts, while an aristocrat held a full emotional breakdown because Lucius the sea noodle was no longer with them. Fish also became dinner party entertainment. Hosts loved serving rare seafood dishes, while explaining exactly how expensive and exotic the ingredients were. Roman banquets often felt less like meals and more like competitive financial flexing with occasional shrimp. The obsession spread beyond fish too. Wealthy Romans imported oysters from faraway coasts, exotic shellfish, and rare animals, simply because possessing unusual creatures made them appear sophisticated. Rome's upper class essentially turned boredom into a full-time luxury arms race. Even emperors joined in. Several rulers became fascinated with extravagant animal collections and marine delicacies. Unlimited wealth combined with unlimited free time has historically produced deeply questionable priorities. Ancient Rome proved this beautifully. For ordinary Romans, these bizarre hobbies became entertainment in themselves. People gossiped endlessly about eccentric aristocrats wasting fortunes on fish ponds, while the rest of society tried not to starve during bad harvests. Because in ancient Rome, boredom could eventually convince a millionaire that the logical next step in life was emotionally bonding with a dangerous eel beside a decorative fountain. Before television, podcasts, or internet comment sections existed, Romans had the Forum, and honestly, it fulfilled almost exactly the same purpose, except people insulted each other face to face while surrounded by marble columns and wandering goats. The Roman Forum in Rome was the centre of public life. Politicians gave speeches there, merchants sold goods, priests performed rituals, lawyers argued court cases, and citizens gathered daily, hoping something dramatic might happen, which it usually did. Rome practically ran on public tension and overheard arguments. For many ordinary Romans, simply hanging around the Forum became entertainment. Citizens wandered through crowded streets, listening to debates, gossiping about scandals, or watching wealthy politicians verbally attack one another, with the emotional intensity of gladiators wearing expensive sandals instead of armor. Public speeches attracted huge crowds. Senators climbed platforms to discuss wars, taxes, laws, and political reforms, while audiences shouted reactions from below. Some speakers became famous for their dramatic performances. Others became famous for being terrible, which honestly drew crowds just as effectively. Imagine being a baker taking a break from work, only to witness two aristocrats screaming accusations about corruption, while hundreds of citizens cheer like spectators at a sporting event. Ancient Rome understood that politics becomes significantly more entertaining when everyone behaves like theatre actors on the verge of emotional collapse. Court trials also fascinated the public. Romans loved legal drama. Lawyers performed passionate speeches filled with insults, emotional appeals, and theatrical gestures, while crowds listened eagerly nearby. Certain famous advocates gained celebrity status because of their speaking skills, and naturally, gossip spread through the Forum at terrifying speed. News about military victories, political betrayals, affairs, murders, and scandals moved rapidly through the crowds. Entire groups of citizens spent hours discussing rumors they barely understood with complete confidence. Humanity has preserved this tradition magnificently. Street philosophers added to the atmosphere too. Some gathered small audiences to lecture about morality, the gods, or the meaning of life, while nearby vendors sold sausages and drunk men argued about horse racing. Rome somehow managed to combine deep intellectual discussion with absolute public chaos at all times. The Forum also served as the perfect place for people watching. Citizens observed wealthy nobles walking through crowds with entourages of servants, while merchants loudly advertised goods nearby. Pickpockets searched for distracted victims while beggars requested coins beside grand temples. It was noisy, crowded, unpredictable, and endlessly entertaining. Of course, fights sometimes erupted. Political arguments became personal very quickly, especially during periods of instability. Crowds shouted, pushed, and occasionally rioted when tensions exploded. Rome loved public spectacle so much that even civic administration occasionally transformed into live-action chaos. Because in ancient Rome, boredom could be cured simply by standing in the middle of the Forum and waiting a few minutes. Eventually, someone important would insult someone else publicly, and suddenly your afternoon was fully booked. Romans had a surprisingly casual relationship with death. Modern people tend to avoid cemeteries unless absolutely necessary. Romans, meanwhile, looked at burial grounds and thought, "This seems like an excellent place for lunch." Across the outskirts of Rome, tombs lined major roads leading into the city. Wealthy families built elaborate burial monuments decorated with statues, inscriptions, and carved portraits designed to preserve their memory forever. Poorer citizens used simpler graves, but almost everyone participated in rituals honoring the dead. And these rituals were not always quiet or gloomy. Many Roman festivals involving ancestors became lively social events filled with food, wine, conversation, and family gatherings. During celebrations like the Parentalia festival, families visited tombs carrying flowers, bread, cakes, salt, and wine to offer deceased relatives. Then, after honouring the dead respectfully, many simply stayed there eating and socialising nearby. Ancient Rome somehow transformed cemeteries into emotionally complicated picnic areas. Entire families gathered beside graves sharing meals, while children played among tombs and relatives exchanged gossip. Imagine explaining to a modern person that your weekend plans involve having snacks with grandfather beside his mausoleum while discussing politics. Romans would see absolutely nothing strange about this sentence. Some tombs even contained benches or dining spaces specifically built for these gatherings. Wealthy Romans wanted descendants to remember them for generations, preferably while consuming wine and roasted chicken in their honour. Truly ambitious posthumous branding. Roman beliefs about spirits also shaped these customs. Many citizens believed the dead remained connected to the living world and required regular remembrance. Neglected spirits might become restless or angry, which gave Roman families extra motivation to maintain these traditions. Nothing strengthens family commitment quite like fear of supernatural revenge from deceased relatives. At certain festivals, Romans decorated graves with flowers and garlands while priests performed rituals nearby. Crowds moved between tombs carrying offerings and speaking prayers. But despite the spiritual atmosphere, these events often remained surprisingly social and noisy. Roman society struggled to do anything quietly for extended periods. Writers occasionally mocked excessive mourning practices too. Some wealthy citizens hired professional mourners to cry dramatically at funerals. Others built absurdly grand tombs to impress society even after death, because in Rome, apparently even dying became another opportunity for competitive status display. Public fascination with death also connected to Roman entertainment culture more broadly. Executions, funeral games, gladiator combats, and ancestor worship all blended together into a civilization deeply comfortable with mortality. Death was visible everywhere, so Romans learned to fold it naturally into daily life instead of hiding from it. For many citizens, visiting tombs relieved boredom through ritual, socializing, memory, and public gathering. Because in ancient Rome, even your dead relatives remained part of the social calendar long after burial. Long before mobile phones destroyed human attention spans, Romans had already mastered the ancient art of sitting around a table becoming irrationally angry over tiny game pieces. Board games were wildly popular throughout the Roman world. Soldiers played them in distant frontier forts, merchants played them in taverns, wealthy nobles played them inside luxurious villas, and ordinary citizens scratched game boards directly into public stone benches so they could play while avoiding responsibilities. Humanity truly commits itself to productivity avoidance across all eras equally. In cities like Rome, games helped people escape boredom during long afternoons or evenings. Taverns echoed with shouting players arguing over moves while spectators gathered nearby, offering completely unwanted advice with absolute confidence. Some things never evolve. One of the most popular Roman games was called Ludus Latruncalorum, often compared to chess or checkers. Players moved pieces strategically across a board, trying to trap enemy pieces through careful positioning. Roman soldiers especially loved strategy games, because apparently conquering half the known world professionally was still not enough tactical stress for one lifetime. Another favourite involved dice and racing pieces around boards resembling modern backgammon. Gambling usually accompanied these games, naturally transforming friendly entertainment into emotionally destructive financial warfare within minutes. Romans could turn absolutely anything into a betting opportunity. Archaeologists have discovered game boards carved into stones all across the former empire, from marketplaces in Italy to military forts in England. Some were scratched into stairs, benches, or public buildings by bored citizens looking to pass the time. Imagine constructing one of the greatest empires in history, only for future archaeologists to uncover evidence that your main activity was aggressively losing board games outside a bakery. Children played games too. Roman kids used nuts, pebbles, bones, and small objects for simple competitions and guessing games. Adults often joined in as well, because Roman maturity standards could become surprisingly flexible after enough wine. Certain wealthy households even hired professional entertainers or game instructors for banquets and gatherings. Guests spent entire evenings competing against one another, while servants carried food and wine through crowded rooms filled with shouting aristocrats dramatically accusing each other of cheating. And cheating absolutely happened. Roman writers complained constantly about dishonest players using loaded dice, hidden pieces, or sneaky distractions to win unfairly. Some things are apparently so deeply human, they survive unchanged for thousands of years. Games also became social bonding rituals. Friends gathered daily around tavern tables, soldiers relaxed after exhausting marches, and families entertained themselves during festivals or holidays. In a harsh world full of disease, war, and political instability, games offered simple moments of escape. Of course, Romans being Romans, these simple moments often ended with someone yelling, gambling away their sandals, and accusing Mercury himself of rigging the board against them personally. If a Roman citizen finished a long day and wanted relaxation, entertainment, terrible decisions, and a reasonable chance of witnessing a fistfight before sunset, there was always the tavern. Roman taverns filled the streets of Rome and every major city across the empire. These places were loud, crowded, smoky rooms packed with merchants, labourers, sailors, gamblers, soldiers, travellers, and people who looked like they had been banned from several other taverns already, which statistically they probably had. The moment you entered, you would smell wine, oil lamps, cooked meat, sweat, smoke, and humanity making poor life choices collectively. Roman taverns were not elegant wine bars. They were chaotic social caves where boredom went to die violently. Wine was the main attraction. Romans drank constantly, morning, afternoon, evening. There was always wine involved somehow. However, most Romans diluted wine with water, because drinking it pure was considered uncivilized, which remains one of history's strangest moral boundaries, considering this same society occasionally fed criminals to wild animals for entertainment. Cheap tavern wine could be terrible. Some was sour, watered down, or mixed with questionable ingredients to stretch supplies further. Tavern owners were not above serving drinks capable of removing paint from walls if profits improved slightly. Naturally, drinking led to entertainment. Patrons sang loudly, argued about politics, debated chariot racing teams, gambled with dice, and insulted each other enthusiastically across crowded tables. A peaceful Roman tavern was usually considered suspicious. Fights erupted constantly. One bad joke, one gambling dispute, or one accidental spilled cup could transform the room into complete chaos. Roman writers frequently complained about taverns filled with shouting drunkards, broken cups, and men dramatically threatening each other over problems nobody would remember the next morning. Many taverns also doubled as gambling dens or unofficial brothels. Some rented small rooms upstairs for travellers or secret meetings. Others became gathering places for criminals, smugglers, or political troublemakers. Respectable upper-class Romans often pretended to despise taverns publicly, while quietly visiting them anyway. Ancient hypocrisy was thriving beautifully. Food was usually simple: bread, olives, stew, sausages, fish, or cheese. Hungry workers gathered there after exhausting days while travellers exchanged stories from distant provinces. Sailors described storms. Soldiers exaggerated military victories. Merchants lied confidently about profits. Roman taverns were basically giant buildings dedicated to alcohol and dramatic storytelling. Even emperors worried about taverns becoming centres of unrest, because crowds of drunk citizens discussing politics rarely ends calmly in any century. Yet authorities could never fully control them because Romans genuinely loved these places. Because in ancient Rome, boredom disappeared quickly once enough wine entered the room. and someone at the next table loudly accused another man of cheating at dice while holding a sausage like a weapon. Modern people often imagine ancient Rome as a world of dignified marble statues, wise philosophers, and noble speeches echoing through grand temples. Archaeologists then uncovered Roman graffiti and realized the empire was also largely powered by immature jokes scratched onto walls by bored citizens. The cities of the Roman world, especially Pompeii, were absolutely covered in graffiti. Thousands of messages survive today, carved into stone walls, taverns, bathhouses, homes, and public buildings. Some were political slogans, some advertised businesses, others were declarations of love, insults, complaints, or deeply unnecessary personal information shared with astonishing confidence. In other words, Romans invented internet comment sections long before electricity. Citizens scratched messages everywhere because walls offered free public entertainment. Walking through Roman streets meant constantly encountering jokes, arguments, advertisements, and random thoughts left behind by strangers. Ancient Rome essentially turned entire cities into giant chaotic group chats. Some graffiti praised famous gladiators or chariot racers. Fans wrote messages celebrating victories, insulting rival teams, or admiring attractive fighters with alarming enthusiasm. Certain gladiators became celebrity heartthrobs, despite the fact their profession technically involved nearly dying for public amusement several afternoons a week. Political graffiti also appeared constantly during elections. Supporters promoted candidates with dramatic slogans while rivals insulted them nearby. One wall might praise a politician as a hero of the people, while another suggested he smelled terrible and cheated on his wife. Democracy was alive and deeply petty. Many surviving messages are surprisingly funny. One Roman complained about terrible wine. Another proudly announced romantic achievements nobody requested details about. Some simply insulted random citizens directly. Imagine walking through the market only to discover someone publicly carved "Lucius is bald and annoying" into a wall for eternity. Taverns contained especially chaotic graffiti. Drunk customers scratched jokes, gambling scores, insults, and declarations of love onto walls. After several cups of wine convinced them their thoughts deserved preservation for future civilizations. Unfortunately for them, archaeologists later agreed. Graffiti also became entertainment, because people stopped to read it publicly. Citizens laughed at jokes, discussed scandals, or argued over insults while wandering through busy streets. Some messages even responded to earlier graffiti, creating full conversations between strangers separated by days or weeks. Humanity saw blank walls and immediately invented public trolling. Remarkable consistency across history. Authorities occasionally tried removing offensive graffiti, but the messages always returned. Rome was simply too crowded, noisy, and bored to stop citizens from carving their opinions onto every available surface. And honestly, the graffiti reveals something strangely comforting about ancient Rome. Beneath the emperors, armies, and marble monuments were ordinary people making jokes, complaining about bad drinks, obsessing over sports, and insulting each other publicly for entertainment. Because even at the height of one of history's greatest empires, humans still looked at a wall and thought, "You know what this place needs? A deeply unnecessary comment." Before modern football, before boxing, before celebrity culture, ancient Rome already had an entertainment obsession powerful enough to consume entire lives: chariot racing. And Romans did not treat it as a casual hobby. They treated it like a religious experience mixed with political warfare and collective emotional collapse. The center of this madness was the massive Circus Maximus in Rome, a gigantic racing stadium capable of holding enormous crowds packed tightly together beneath the burning sun. Tens of thousands of screaming spectators gathered there to watch lightweight chariots race dangerously around narrow turning posts at terrifying speeds. The races themselves were brutally dangerous. Drivers controlled teams of horses while balancing inside fragile wooden chariots with almost no protection. One mistake could send horses, wheels, and human bodies crashing violently across the track, while crowds roared with excitement. Ancient Romans looked at horrifying accidents and thought, "Excellent afternoon entertainment." The racers became celebrities across the empire. Successful drivers earned fortunes, fame, and devoted fan followings. Some rose from slavery to incredible wealth purely through racing victories. Fans memorized their names, followed their careers obsessively, and argued endlessly about which racers were superior. Humanity discovered sports debates extremely early and immediately became unbearable about them. But the true obsession centered around the racing factions: the blues, greens, reds, and whites. These teams dominated Roman public life. Citizens dressed in faction colours, screamed support during races, and insulted rival supporters with shocking intensity. A Roman man could lose money gambling on races, get into a tavern fight defending his faction, and still return the next morning completely emotionally committed to the exact same team. Sports loyalty was already functioning exactly as intended 2,000 years ago. Crowds inside the Circus Maximus became deafening. Fans shouted, waved cloth banners, placed bets, cursed rival racers, and exploded with joy or rage during close finishes. Certain emperors openly supported specific factions, making the races politically charged as well as entertaining. Gambling surrounded every event. Citizens wagered fortunes on outcomes while rumours spread about horse conditions, driver injuries, or secret advantages. Bookmakers thrived on public obsession. Somewhere in Rome, a man definitely convinced himself his financial future depended entirely on a horse named Thunder of Apollo not crashing into a wall at full speed. The races also offered ordinary citizens emotional escape. Rome was crowded, unequal, and politically unstable, but inside the circus, everyone focused together on speed, danger, noise, and tribal loyalty. For a few hours, daily problems disappeared beneath pounding hooves and screaming crowds. Of course, rivalries sometimes became violent. Fans fought in the streets after races, and tensions occasionally erupted into riots. Nothing unites humanity across history, quite like the sentence, "People became far too aggressive about sports." Because in ancient Rome, boredom vanished instantly the moment thousands of citizens gathered together screaming themselves hoarse over tiny speeding chariots circling a dusty track. And finally, when gambling, taverns, racing, bathhouses and public chaos no longer felt exciting enough, Romans turned to the greatest spectacle of all, the arena. Towering over Rome stood the massive Colosseum, a structure so enormous and intimidating that even today it still feels unreal when you stand beside it. But to the Romans, it was not merely architecture. It was entertainment on an industrial scale. The Colosseum hosted gladiator battles, animal hunts, public executions, theatrical performances, and giant spectacles designed to overwhelm the senses completely. Tens of thousands of citizens packed into the stands to cheer, gamble, scream, eat, argue, and watch violence unfold beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun. Ancient Rome essentially invented the blockbuster event. For many Romans, attending the games became one of life's greatest pleasures. Wealthy senators arrived in elegant clothing, while ordinary citizens crowded into upper seating sections carrying snacks and wine. Vendors moved through the audience selling food as crowds buzzed with excitement before the events began. The atmosphere probably felt less like a solemn ceremony and more like an extremely dangerous sports festival. Then the games started. Gladiators entered the arena before roaring crowds, wearing armor that varied depending on their fighting style. Some carried nets and tridents, others wielded swords and shields. Many were slaves, prisoners, or condemned criminals. Those successful gladiators could become famous celebrities admired across the empire. Some women reportedly fell in love with them despite the small complication that their profession involved, being stabbed professionally for public amusement. Animal hunts shocked audiences too. Lions, leopards, bears, elephants, and exotic creatures imported from Africa and Asia appeared in elaborate staged hunts. Rome conquered enormous territories, partly so wealthy citizens could eventually sit comfortably in stadium seats, watching confused animals sprint around sand-covered arenas. Human history takes strange turns. Executions also became public entertainment. Criminals were sometimes forced into mythological reenactments ending in death before massive audiences. To modernize, it feels horrifying, but Roman society viewed these spectacles as demonstrations of power, justice, discipline, and imperial dominance. Violence was woven deeply into everyday Roman life in ways difficult for us to fully understand today. And yet, Beneath all the brutality, the games also fulfilled a very human purpose: distraction. They gave citizens excitement, emotion, tribal loyalty, shared experiences, and temporary escape from ordinary struggles, because Rome feared boredom almost as much as invasion. And when one of history's greatest empires needed entertainment, it did not think small. It built colossal arenas, filled them with roaring crowds, and transformed violence itself into spectacle. So the next time you feel guilty for wasting an evening watching meaningless entertainment, remember this. At least you are probably not sitting inside a giant stone stadium screaming over a man fighting a leopard with a net while eating olives beside 70,000 other people. Progress comes slowly. Everything along the Silk Road began with fabric. Not conquest, not religion, not philosophy, fabric. Somewhere in ancient China, likely during the distant centuries before the rise of the Han Dynasty, Chinese artisans discovered how to create silk from the cocoons of silkworms. At first glance, the process sounded deeply unimpressive. Tiny worms eating mulberry leaves inside baskets. Hardly the beginning of one of history's greatest trade networks. Yet from those fragile threads came a material so beautiful that entire civilizations became obsessed with it. Compared to the coarse wool, rough linen, and heavy fabrics worn across much of the ancient world, silk seemed almost magical. It was smooth, light, cool against the skin, and shimmered when it moved beneath sunlight or firelight. To foreign merchants encountering it for the first time, silk looked less like cloth and more like liquid wealth. And wealth, as humanity has repeatedly demonstrated, travels quickly. Chinese rulers understood the value of silk immediately. For centuries, the techniques behind silk production remained one of China's most carefully guarded secrets. Silkworm cultivation became a state-protected industry. According to later stories, revealing the process to foreigners could bring severe punishment. The empire treated silkworms with the same protective paranoia modern nations reserve for military technology, which is objectively hilarious when you remember the technology involved emotionally unstable caterpillars eating leaves. Inside China itself, clothing already carried deep social meaning. Richly coloured silk robes marked noble status, political authority, and court rank. Bright yellow became strongly associated with the emperor, while embroidered dragons, phoenixes, clouds, and celestial symbols transformed garments into statements of cosmic power. Clothing did not simply cover the body. It announced your place in the universe before you even spoke, and usually before someone else bowed nervously in your direction. As trade expanded westward during the Han period, silk slowly began leaving China through caravan routes crossing deserts, mountain passes, and oasis cities. Merchants packed bolts of fabric onto camels traveling across Central Asia toward Persia, India, and eventually the Mediterranean world. Few traders crossed the entire route themselves. Instead, silk passed through countless hands, changing owners, languages, and prices at every stage, and somehow becoming more expensive every single time. Along the journey, the fabric carried more than luxury. It carried ideas, colours, embroidery techniques, tailoring styles, and decorative patterns slowly travelled beside the caravans themselves. A robe designed in China might inspire Persian embroidery generations later. Mediterranean elites would eventually wear Eastern silks while complaining about foreign influence destroying traditional values. Some things in history never truly change. As silk travelled westward out of China, it entered the lands of Persia, where fashion became something far more elaborate than simple clothing. The Persians did not merely import fabrics, they transformed them, positioned between East and West. The great Persian empires became the cultural middlemen of the Silk Road. Caravans carrying Chinese silk, Indian cotton, Central Asian furs, and Mediterranean dyes all passed through Persian cities at some point. Places like Ctesiphon and Samarkand grew wealthy from trade flowing across deserts and mountain roads. And wherever merchants gathered, fashion inevitably followed. Because humans can survive wars, plagues, and collapsing empires, yet still somehow remain deeply concerned about sleeves, Persian elites developed some of the most luxurious clothing in the ancient world. Long flowing robes, fitted trousers, embroidered tunics, jeweled belts, and richly patterned cloaks became symbols of status throughout the region. Unlike the simpler draped garments common in Greece and early Rome, Persian clothing emphasized layered tailoring and vivid decoration. This style shocked many Mediterranean observers at first. Greek writers often viewed Persian fashion as overly luxurious, soft, or excessive, which was rather bold criticism coming from societies where philosophers occasionally debated ethics while wearing what amounted to expensive bedsheets. But Persian fashion worked brilliantly for the realities of empire. Riders crossing cold plateaus and desert winds needed fitted garments and trousers suited for horseback travel. Flowing robes still conveyed elegance, but practical tailoring became equally important. Clothing along the Silk Road constantly adapted to climate, trade, and movement. Persian weavers and artisans also became masters of combining influences from multiple cultures. Chinese silk patterns mixed with Iranian motifs, floral designs, hunting scenes, winged animals, and geometric embroidery spread across fabrics traded westward toward Byzantium and beyond. Some textiles became so valuable they were treated almost like treasure rather than clothing. And honestly, if you spent 6 months crossing deserts with bandits nearby just to transport a single embroidered robe, you would probably treat it like treasure too. Colour carried enormous meaning in Persian courts. Deep reds, royal blues, gold embroidery, and intricate repeating patterns announced wealth instantly. Dyes were expensive, fabrics difficult to produce, and decoration required countless hours of skilled labour. Fashion became visible proof of political power. The Silk Road did not move styles in one direction alone. Persia acted like a giant cultural filter, absorbing influences from east and west before reshaping them into something entirely new. And eventually, those Persian styles would travel even farther west, into the wardrobes of Roman elites who loudly condemned Eastern luxury while secretly wrapping themselves in it whenever possible. When silk finally reached the Mediterranean world, the Romans reacted with the calm restraint history remembers them for, which is to say, absolutely none whatsoever. By the time silk entered Roman markets through Eastern trade networks, it had already passed through countless merchants, caravan cities, and Persian middlemen. The fabric arriving in Rome was astonishingly expensive. Most Romans had never seen anything like it before. Silk shimmered in candlelight, flowed softly across the body, and appeared almost transparent compared to the heavier wool garments common throughout the empire. Roman elites became obsessed immediately. Wealthy senators, noble women, merchants, and imperial families paid enormous sums for imported silk garments and fabrics. Wearing silk quickly became a powerful status symbol. If you appeared in public wrapped in Eastern silk, you were announcing two things very clearly. First, that you were extremely rich, and second, that you had absolutely no interest in subtlety. Roman writers complained about this constantly. Several Roman authors criticized silk as decadent, immoral, and dangerously foreign. Some believed silk clothing made men appear weak or feminine. Others complained that the thin material revealed too much of the body. The Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger criticized transparent silk garments, while writers like Pliny the Elder grumbled bitterly about the massive amounts of Roman gold flowing eastward to pay for luxury goods. Rome, meanwhile, continued buying silk anyway, because civilizations throughout history have always insisted luxury is destroying society, while simultaneously standing in line to purchase more luxury. At first, Romans did not fully understand where silk even came from. Some believed it grew on trees. Others imagined mysterious Eastern peoples harvesting soft fibers from forests somewhere beyond Persia. The actual process involving silkworms remained largely unknown in the Mediterranean for centuries, because China guarded the secret carefully. And honestly, if your economy depended on magical shiny fabric produced by worms, you would guard the secret too. Roman fashion slowly adapted to these imported materials. Silk began appearing in decorative trims, tunics, shawls, and eventually full garments among the wealthiest classes. Eastern influences also spread through embroidery styles, jewelry designs, dyes, and luxury tailoring. The empire's ports and cities became filled with merchants wearing mixed fashions from Syria, Egypt, Persia, and beyond. The Silk Road was quietly changing Roman appearance one garment at a time. Yet many Romans remained deeply conflicted about it all. Traditionalists believed foreign luxuries weakened old Roman virtues like discipline, simplicity, and military toughness. But younger elites embraced Eastern fashion enthusiastically, especially inside imperial courts, where appearance became political theatre. In the end, silk conquered Rome far more successfully than most invading armies ever could. It simply did so through clothing instead of swords. Between China and the Mediterranean stretched a chain of oasis cities that became the beating heart of Silk Road fashion. Places like Kashgar, Bukhara, and Merv were not merely stops for tired merchants and thirsty camels. They were giant cultural crossroads where fabrics, languages, religions, hairstyles, dyes, and tailoring traditions collided constantly. And every traveller arriving there brought something new to wear. The Silk Road was never one single road. It was a sprawling network of caravan routes crossing deserts, mountains, and grasslands. Merchants from China, Persia, India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world all passed through these oasis settlements carrying goods from thousands of miles away. In the crowded marketplaces, people encountered foreign clothing styles daily. A merchant from Persia might wear embroidered trousers and layered robes beside an Indian trader wrapped in cotton garments dyed with indigo. Nearby stood Turkic horsemen dressed in fur-lined coats suited for brutal winters, while Chinese envoys arrived in flowing silk robes decorated with careful court symbolism. To ancient travellers, these cities must have felt like walking directly into another world every 10 minutes. Naturally, fashion began blending almost immediately. Tailors copied foreign cuts and stitching methods. Wealthy merchants mixed fabrics from different regions into single outfits. Decorative patterns migrated between cultures through trade far faster than armies ever could. Central Asian weavers became especially skilled at combining Eastern and Western influences into entirely new textile styles. Some caravan cities grew famous specifically for their cloth production. Samarkand, for example, became known for luxury textiles and dyeing techniques. Sogdian merchants carried these fabrics across enormous distances, helping spread fashion trends between empires. In many ways, they acted like the fashion influencers of the ancient world, only with fewer ring lights and significantly more camel-related suffering. Colour played an enormous role in these exchanges. Chinese silks brought shimmering yellows and reds westward. Persian artisans perfected deep blues and intricate gold embroidery. Indian cottons introduced vibrant dyes and lightweight fabrics suited for warmer climates. Steppe cultures contributed fur, leatherwork, and riding garments designed for movement and survival. Even religion-shaped clothing styles. Buddhist monks travelling through Central Asia spread robes and textile traditions between monasteries. Islamic expansion later introduced new preferences for modesty, layering, and geometric decoration. Fashion along the Silk Road constantly evolved because the road itself never stopped moving. Yet despite all these influences mixing together, clothing still revealed identity instantly. A traveller's fabrics, colours, jewellery or stitching could expose his homeland before he even spoke. Along the Silk Road, fashion became a language understood across deserts and empires, and sometimes it was far more useful than words. Along the Silk Road, colour itself became a luxury, not because people lacked imagination, but because producing vibrant dyes in the ancient world was astonishingly difficult, expensive, and occasionally smelled like something had died very aggressively nearby. Before modern chemistry, creating rich colours required crushing minerals, boiling plants, fermenting insects, collecting rare shells, or combining substances through processes that often resembled medieval witchcraft, performed by exhausted textile workers. The brighter the colour, the more wealth usually stood behind it, and everyone noticed. As trade expanded across the Silk Road, dyes travelled beside silk, spices, and precious metals. Chinese merchants exported brilliant reds and yellows used in court garments. Indian traders carried indigo, one of the most valuable blue dyes in the ancient world. Persian artisans mastered layered colouring techniques that gave fabrics incredible depth and richness. Meanwhile, Mediterranean elites became obsessed with purple dyes linked to royalty and imperial authority, especially Tyrian purple. Produced from tiny sea snails in the eastern Mediterranean, Tyrian purple dye was so expensive that it became associated almost entirely with emperors and extreme wealth. Thousands of shells were required to create even small amounts of dye. Entire coastlines reportedly smelled horrific during production. Imagine spending a fortune to smell like dead seafood while looking magnificent. Humanity truly commits to aesthetics. Colour also carried political meaning everywhere along the Silk Road. In China, certain shades became associated with imperial authority and heavenly order. Persian nobles used deep reds, gold embroidery and royal blues to demonstrate status at court. Roman emperors reserved purple garments for the highest ranks of society, while lower classes risked punishment for imitating elite fashion too closely. Apparently, ancient governments also enjoyed telling people what they were not allowed to wear, but dyes did more than display wealth. They revealed connections. A merchant wearing Indian indigo in Persia, or Chinese silk embroidered with Central Asian patterns, became living proof of international trade. Fashion showed how deeply connected these distant civilizations had become. One robe might contain silk from China, dyes from India, embroidery inspired by Persia, and tailoring influenced by nomadic riders from the steppe. Entire continents quietly stitched together into a single garment. The demand for luxury colours also transformed economies along the Silk Road. Entire towns specialised in textile dyeing. Workshops guarded recipes carefully. Skilled dyers became valuable artisans whose work could make rulers appear more powerful, elegant, or divinely favoured. Because throughout history, rulers have always understood one eternal political truth. If you dress impressively enough, people may temporarily ignore the fact your empire is collapsing, at least until the taxes arrive. Not every influence along the Silk Road came from wealthy cities, royal courts, or elegant merchants wrapped in silk. Some of the most important fashion changes came from nomads, thundering across the grasslands on horseback. The vast Eurasian steppe stretched from Mongolia to Eastern Europe, home to countless riding cultures including the Scythians, Turks, Mongols, and other pastoral societies. These groups lived in climates that could shift from burning heat to brutal cold with terrifying speed. Their clothing needed to survive wind, snow, rain, and endless travel across open land, which meant practicality mattered far more than looking graceful while standing dramatically near a marble column. Nomadic riders transformed fashion across the Silk Road because they introduced something revolutionary to many settled civilizations. Clothing designed for movement, long flowing robes looked impressive inside palaces. They looked considerably less impressive while trying to remain alive on horseback during a freezing dust storm. Steppe cultures favoured trousers, fitted tunics, leather boots, fur-lined cloaks, belts, and layered garments suited for riding. These styles spread gradually into Persia, China, and eventually even parts of the Mediterranean world. Horse-riding elites everywhere slowly adopted more fitted and flexible clothing because, rather inconveniently for traditionalists, the nomads were correct. Trousers in particular shocked many early Mediterranean societies. Ancient Greeks and Romans initially associated pants with barbarian peoples from colder northern or eastern regions. Civilized men, in their opinion, wore tunics and togas. This belief usually lasted right until somebody had to spend several days riding through winter weather. In China, northern nomadic influence deeply shaped military and frontier fashion during several dynasties. Cavalry forces adopted riding jackets, boots, and practical layered clothing inspired by steppe warriors. Some emperors even encouraged these changes, because armies wearing elegant flowing sleeves while mounted on horseback tended to experience highly educational disasters. Meanwhile, fur became another major Silk Road luxury. Sable, fox, mink, and other animal pelts travelled across trade networks into wealthy urban markets. Fur-lined garments symbolized both wealth and survival, especially in colder northern regions. Nomadic decoration styles also spread widely. Animal motifs, metal belt ornaments, embroidered riding gear, and geometric patterns influenced textile designs far beyond the steppe itself. Even royal courts eventually borrowed elements from cultures they once dismissed as uncivilized, because fashion has always worked this way. First, society mocks foreign clothing. Then younger generations adopt it enthusiastically. Then elites pretend they invented it themselves all along. By the later centuries of Silk Road trade, the line between Eastern, Western, and nomadic fashion had become increasingly blurred. Styles mixed constantly across empires, and somewhere on the windswept steppe, A mounted horseman wearing practical trousers quietly won the argument centuries before everyone else admitted it. By the time silk reached the great cities of the Byzantine world, fashion had become inseparable from power itself. In places like Constantinople, clothing was not simply about beauty or wealth. It was political theatre performed daily beneath golden domes, candlelight, and the watchful eyes of an empire obsessed with ceremony. The Byzantines inherited Roman traditions, Eastern luxury, and Christian symbolism all at once. The result was some of the most elaborate court fashion the ancient and medieval world had ever seen. Silk robes shimmered with gold embroidery. Cloaks displayed imperial eagles, crosses, lions, and saints. Jewel-covered belts and collars turned aristocrats into walking treasure chests. Subtlety died very early inside the Byzantine court. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire depended heavily on imported silk, travelling westward from Asia through Persian and Silk Road trade networks. But in the 6th century, according to later accounts, Byzantine agents finally smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, hidden inside bamboo staffs. Essentially, one of history's greatest industrial espionage operations involved sneaking worms across Asia. Once Byzantium established its own silk industry, imperial workshops inside Constantinople began producing extraordinary luxury fabrics reserved for emperors, nobles, bishops, and foreign rulers. These textiles became diplomatic weapons as much as clothing. Silk garments were gifted to kings, ambassadors, and military allies to demonstrate Byzantine prestige. And frankly, receiving glowing gold silk from Constantinople probably felt significantly more impressive than receiving another letter demanding taxes. Colour and imagery inside Byzantine fashion carried intense meaning. Purple remained the supreme imperial colour, linked directly to rulership and divine authority. The phrase "born in the purple" referred specifically to children born into the imperial family. Gold threads symbolized heavenly glory. Religious imagery merged with royal symbolism until emperors almost appeared half-sacred themselves, which was politically convenient. Court ceremonies became enormous performances of controlled fashion. Officials wore specific robes according to rank. Eunuchs, generals, priests, senators, and diplomats all dressed differently, depending on their position within the imperial hierarchy. A trained observer could supposedly identify a person's status instantly by examining their clothing alone. Imagine living in a society where your sleeve pattern determined how deeply people bowed at you. Byzantine silk also influenced fashion far beyond imperial borders. Western European rulers desperately sought Byzantine textiles. Islamic courts admired and adapted many Byzantine designs. Trade carried these styles across the Mediterranean and deeper into Europe. The Silk Road had now fully connected east and west through fabric. Chinese silk techniques, Persian decoration, nomadic practicality, Roman luxury, and Christian imperial symbolism all merged inside Byzantine fashion. The empire became a living museum of Silk Road influences, stitched together into robes glittering beneath cathedral lights. And every thread quietly told the story of continents connected long before modern borders ever existed. Along the Silk Road, religion moved almost as constantly as merchants did. And wherever faith travelled, fashion followed close behind, carrying bags, manuscripts, and opinions about appropriate clothing. Buddhist monks crossed deserts between China, India, and Central Asia, wearing layered robes suited for long journeys and harsh climates. Christian missionaries travelled through Persian and Byzantine territories, dressed in dark wool garments symbolizing humility and devotion. Later, Muslim traders and scholars carried Islamic styles across enormous distances from Arabia into Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. The Silk Road did not simply exchange goods. It exchanged ways of dressing the human body itself. Religious clothing often spread because it carried authority. Monks, priests, scholars, and pilgrims were respected figures, and local populations sometimes adopted elements of their appearance. Buddhist robes influenced textile traditions across East and Central Asia. Islamic preferences for loose layered garments, head coverings, and geometric decoration shaped fashion across growing Muslim trade cities. Christian clergy in Byzantium popularized richly embroidered ceremonial robes, inspired partly by older Roman and Persian traditions. Meanwhile, Ordinary travelers copied whatever seemed useful or prestigious. A merchant crossing Central Asia might adopt local head coverings for protection against dust and sun. A wealthy Persian noble could wear Chinese silk decorated with Buddhist-inspired motifs. Byzantine artisans borrowed Eastern floral designs, while Islamic weavers adapted techniques from Persia and China. Fashion spread quietly through imitation, not through royal decrees or military conquest alone, but through thousands of ordinary people noticing attractive fabrics and thinking, yes, I would also like to look slightly more impressive than my neighbour. Pilgrimage routes became especially important for spreading styles. Travellers visiting sacred cities returned home carrying foreign textiles, jewellery, dyes and tailoring ideas. Along the Silk Road, holy journeys often doubled as accidental fashion exchanges. Even modesty standards changed through these interactions. Different religions promoted different ideas about how much of the body should be covered, what colours carried spiritual meaning, and how clothing reflected morality or status. In some regions, loose-layered garments became associated with dignity and wisdom. In others, simplicity signalled holiness while excessive decoration suggested vanity. Of course, wealthy elites usually interpreted simplicity very creatively. A ruler might commission robes covered in gold thread while technically maintaining modest overall shapes approved by religious custom. Humanity has always possessed remarkable talent for obeying spiritual rules in the most luxurious way possible. Over centuries, the Silk Road created entire cities where Buddhist monks, Muslim merchants, Nestorian Christians, Persian nobles, and Chinese officials all walked the same streets, wearing clothing shaped by dozens of overlapping traditions. And somewhere in those crowded marketplaces, surrounded by foreign languages and shimmering fabrics, the ancient world slowly learned something powerful. Even belief itself could leave threads behind. By the final centuries of the Great Silk Road era, fashion across Eurasia had become something entirely new. No single empire, culture, or people controlled it anymore. The road stretching between China, Persia, India, Central Asia, Arabia, Byzantium, and the Mediterranean had spent centuries exchanging fabrics, dyes, embroidery styles, jewellery, tailoring methods, and ideas about beauty itself. Generation after generation of merchants, nomads, pilgrims, soldiers, and nobles slowly stitched distant civilizations together through clothing. And most of them probably never realized they were doing it. A wealthy merchant in Constantinople might wear Chinese silk dyed with Persian techniques and tailored in a style influenced by Central Asian riders. A noble woman in Persia could decorate her robes with patterns inspired by Buddhist art from farther east. Islamic courts adopted textiles from Byzantium, while European rulers desperately competed for Eastern luxury fabrics they barely understood. The Silk Road turned fashion into global conversation long before the modern world existed. Even after political empires rose and collapsed, the movement of style continued. The Mongol Empire later accelerated these exchanges dramatically by connecting enormous territories beneath a single system of trade routes. Travelers like Marco Polo described markets overflowing with silks, dyes, jewels, and textiles gathered from across continents. Of course, Marco Polo also described plenty of things historians still argue about today, but the luxury fabrics were definitely real. Meanwhile, Europe itself slowly changed under these influences. Silk weaving spread westward. Eastern-inspired embroidery appeared in royal courts. Trade cities like Venice grew rich importing luxury goods from farther east. Even medieval European fashion eventually carried fingerprints left by centuries of Silk Road exchange. And all of it began with caravans moving slowly through deserts, carrying fragile cloth beside spices and silver. Yet the Silk Road's greatest impact on fashion was not one specific garment or fabric. It was the blending itself. Before these trade networks expanded, many societies dressed according to relatively isolated local traditions. After centuries of Silk Road exchange, clothing became layered with foreign influences almost everywhere. Styles adapted constantly as cultures borrowed, copied, improved, and reinvented what they encountered. Fashion became evidence that civilizations were connected whether rulers liked it or not. Roman senators once complained silk weakened traditional values. Persian elites mocked simpler foreign clothing. Chinese courts viewed outsiders as uncivilized. Nomads laughed at impractical city fashions, yet eventually every culture borrowed from the others anyway, because humans have always been curious creatures. We trade stories, we trade beliefs, we trade food, and apparently we also spend thousands of years looking at foreign clothing and quietly thinking, actually, that does look pretty good. The Silk Road may have carried silk across continents, but in the process, it also carried the ancient world towards something surprisingly modern. Shared culture, woven together one thread at a time. When people picture Vikings today, they usually imagine enormous fur capes, horned helmets, leather armor everywhere, and warriors looking as though they are moments away from auditioning for a heavy metal album cover. Real Vikings would probably stare at these depictions in complete confusion. First of all, the horned helmets are almost certainly nonsense. Second, most Viking clothing was designed less for looking dramatic on mountaintops and more for surviving Scandinavian weather that seemed specifically engineered to punish human optimism. The Viking world was cold, wet, windy, muddy, and deeply inconvenient for anyone interested in fashionable suffering. Winters stretched endlessly across Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the North Atlantic settlements. Rain soaked clothing constantly. Sea spray covered travellers during long voyages. Farmers worked outdoors through brutal weather for most of the year. So Viking fashion became practical above all else. The foundation of most Viking clothing was wool. Nearly everyone wore it. Wool kept warmth, even when damp, lasted for years, and could survive the hard realities of farming, sailing, fishing, and warfare. Linen, made from flax, was also common, and usually worn underneath heavier wool garments, because it felt softer against the skin. Even simple clothing required enormous labour. Families spun thread by hand, wove cloth on upright looms, dyed fabrics using plants or minerals, and stitched garments carefully over weeks or months. A single tunic represented serious work. Vikings repaired clothing constantly because replacing it was expensive and time-consuming. This was not a society casually ordering replacement boots because last week's pair felt slightly uncomfortable. Men commonly wore wool tunics over linen undershirts, paired with trousers tied at the waist and wrapped leg coverings for warmth. Women often wore long linen dresses beneath wool overdresses, held together with decorative brooches. Cloaks provided extra protection against cold winds and rain, especially during travel, and the cloaks mattered enormously. A thick wool cloak could mean the difference between sleeping warmly beside a fire or slowly transforming into an extremely frozen historical example. Leather appeared mostly in belts, shoes, pouches, and smaller accessories, rather than the endless leather armor often shown in modern fantasy depictions. Real Viking armor was expensive. Most ordinary people simply could not afford elaborate protective gear. A practical wool tunic and good cloak were far more useful for everyday life than dressing like an angry iron statue. Colour also mattered more than many people realise. Wealthier Vikings wore dyed clothing in reds, blues, greens and yellows whenever possible. Bright colours displayed status because dyes were expensive and difficult to produce. Even in the harsh north, people still wanted to look impressive. Human vanity, it turns out, survives remarkably well in cold climates. For most Vikings, clothing was not about preparing for battle. It was about surviving ordinary life. The vast majority of people in Scandinavia were farmers, fishers, craftsmen, traders, or sailors. Their days involved hauling water, chopping wood, repairing boats, tending animals, weaving cloth, and trying not to freeze while doing all of it. Viking fashion needed to handle mud, smoke, rain, animal fur, sea salt, and endless physical labour, which meant practicality always came first. The basic garment for Viking men was the tunic, usually made from wool. It hung roughly to the thighs or knees and was worn over a linen undershirt. Sleeves could be tight or loose depending on local styles and wealth. Tunics were often belted at the waist, partly for comfort and partly because belts allowed men to carry knives, pouches, tools, or small personal items, because apparently every Viking outfit also doubled as portable storage. Trousers varied across regions. Some were loose and baggy, especially in eastern Scandinavian areas influenced by contact with Slavic and steppe cultures. Others were tighter around the legs, making movement easier during work or travel. Leg wraps, long strips of wool wound around the calves, helped provide warmth and support while walking across rough terrain. Shoes were surprisingly sophisticated for the period. Most Viking footwear used soft leather stitched carefully into practical walking shoes or ankle boots. Archaeological finds show many were well crafted and comfortable enough for long-distance travel. Unlike modern fashion trends that occasionally appear designed by people actively hostile toward feet, Viking shoes prioritized survival. Women's clothing followed similar principles of layering and warmth. A typical Viking woman often wore a long linen underdress beneath a wool overdress, suspended by shoulder straps, fastened with oval brooches. Between these brooches hung strings of beads, keys, tools, or personal ornaments displaying wealth and household status. Married women especially carried keys as symbols of authority within the home. Fashion and responsibility travelled together. Aprons, shawls, cloaks, gloves, and head coverings added protection during colder months. Clothing had to adapt constantly to changing weather, household labour, and travel. Wealthier women might wear imported silks, fine dyes, or decorative embroidery obtained through trade networks, stretching into Byzantium and the Islamic world. Even children dressed similarly to adults, just in smaller, rapidly outgrown versions that probably caused parents endless frustration considering how long clothing took to produce. Yet despite all this practicality, Viking clothing still reflected identity and pride. Patterns, colours, jewellery and fabric quality all revealed status, regional traditions and personal wealth. Because even while hauling fish through freezing rain, humans remained deeply committed to looking slightly better than their neighbours. If there was one item Vikings truly depended on, it was the cloak. Not swords, not axes, certainly not horned helmets, cloaks. In the harsh climates of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic, staying warm was not a matter of comfort. It was survival. A Viking travelling by sea, farming through winter, or sleeping beside a weak fire during a storm needed layers capable of blocking freezing winds and endless damp air. Without proper outer clothing, even ordinary travel could become deadly very quickly, which tends to make people care deeply about wool quality. Most Viking cloaks were made from thick woven wool and fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin. Some reached down to the knees while heavier travel cloaks extended farther for extra warmth. Cloaks could be wrapped tightly around the body during storms or used as blankets during long journeys. A good cloak was essentially a portable wall against nature's hatred. Wool worked remarkably well for northern climates because it retained warmth even when wet. This mattered enormously for sailors spending days exposed to sea spray and rain. Vikings understood layering instinctively. Linen rested against the skin while wool trapped heat outside. Multiple garments created insulation long before modern winter jackets existed, and unlike modern synthetic fabrics, Viking wool also carried the charming additional feature of smelling like smoke, sheep, seawater, and daily survival. Fur added another layer of warmth and status. Wealthier Vikings wore cloaks trimmed with animal pelts, such as fox, bear, beaver, wolf, or sable. Fur-lined garments provided excellent protection during winter travel, and also displayed wealth publicly. Exotic furs imported through trade networks became especially prized among elites, because humanity has always enjoyed turning dangerous animals into fashion accessories. Not everyone could afford luxury pelts, of course. Most ordinary people relied on simpler wool cloaks repaired repeatedly over years of use. Patches were common, fraying edges were normal. Clothing lasted as long as physically possible, because producing textiles required enormous labour. Travel shaped Viking outerwear heavily. Sailors crossing the North Sea or travelling toward Iceland, Greenland, and beyond needed garments capable of enduring brutal winds and freezing temperatures. Thick hoods, mittens, and layered wraps protected exposed skin during storms. Archaeological evidence even suggests some cloaks may have been treated with oils or animal fats to improve water resistance, which probably worked wonderfully right until somebody sat too close to a fire. Yet Viking outer clothing was not purely practical. Decorative borders, tablet weaving, dyed fabrics, and ornate brooches still appeared even on heavy winter garments. A wealthy chieftain's cloak could display imported dyes, silk trim, or intricate patterns woven into the fabric itself. Because even while battling icy winds from the North Atlantic, Vikings still understood one eternal truth. You freeze more confidently when dressed well. If modern people were suddenly transported into the Viking world, one of the first things they would notice is not the cold, it is the mud. Mud around farms, mud near docks, mud inside villages, mud mixed with animal waste, rainwater, ash, fish remains, and whatever else medieval Scandinavians accidentally stepped in that morning. Viking settlements were deeply familiar with damp ground and unpleasant walking conditions, which explains why shoes mattered so much. Viking footwear was practical, durable, and surprisingly well made. Archaeological discoveries from places like York and Scandinavian settlements reveal a wide variety of leather shoes and boots carefully stitched for everyday use. These were not crude scraps tied around the feet. Many Viking shoes show impressive craftsmanship and thoughtful design, unlike certain modern fashion trends that appear engineered specifically to destroy ankles. Most Viking shoes were made using soft leather turned inside out during stitching, and then reversed once completed. This technique protected seams from wearing down too quickly. Shoes usually fit closely around the foot and fastened with leather straps, toggles or laces. Low ankle shoes were common for ordinary daily work, while taller boots provided better protection during travel or harsh weather. Soles remained fairly thin compared to modern footwear, meaning Vikings felt the ground beneath them constantly while walking, which probably gave them extraordinary balance in deeply miserable winters. Leather itself was valuable, requiring skilled tanning processes using bark, animal fats, and time-consuming labor. Shoes wore out quickly in wet conditions, so repairing them became a constant part of life. Archaeologists frequently find patched footwear showing repeated maintenance rather than replacement. Vikings treated shoes like important investments because creating new ones required serious effort. And frankly, after spending weeks making footwear by hand, you would probably repair it 17 times too. Inside homes, people may have gone barefoot or worn simple soft shoes depending on the season and status. But outdoors, proper footwear was essential for farming, trading, traveling, and surviving northern climates. Sailors especially needed reliable shoes capable of gripping wet wooden decks during storms. Fashion still played a role, naturally. Some shoes featured decorative stitching or dyed leather. Wealthier Vikings could afford finer craftsmanship and imported materials. Coloured leather shoes occasionally appeared among elites, though practicality always remained more important than excessive decoration. Viking footwear also reflected the enormous travel networks connecting Scandinavia to Europe, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Trade introduced new techniques, materials, and styles into northern shoemaking traditions. Even something as ordinary as a boot quietly carried evidence of global contact, because the Viking world was never isolated. It was connected constantly through trade, raids, and exploration. And somewhere in a muddy Scandinavian village, an exhausted Viking probably spent half the evening drying his soaked leather shoes near the fire, while silently wondering why every road in existence had transformed into a swamp again. Vikings did not walk around covered head to toe in gold like fantasy kings from modern television, but they absolutely enjoyed showing off whenever possible. In the Viking world, jewelry served many purposes at once. It displayed wealth, reinforced social status, secured clothing, acted as portable savings, and occasionally functioned as emergency payment during trade. A wealthy Viking might carry part of his fortune directly on his body, partly because banks did not exist and partly because intimidating jewelry looked impressive during negotiations. Nothing strengthens an argument quite like casually wearing enough silver to buy a small farm. Brooches were among the most important pieces of Viking jewelry, especially for women. Oval brooches fastened the shoulder straps of overdresses, while smaller brooches secured cloaks or shawls. These were not tiny hidden accessories. Many were large, beautifully decorated, and highly visible symbols of status. Some featured intricate knotwork, animal designs, or geometric patterns reflecting Norse artistic traditions. Others incorporated imported styles influenced by trade with the British Isles, Byzantium, or the Islamic world. Viking jewelry constantly absorbed foreign ideas because Scandinavian traders traveled astonishing distances, and wherever humans travel, they inevitably return home wanting other people's shiny objects. Men also wore brooches for cloaks, though rings, arm rings, necklaces, and pendants became especially important among wealthier warriors and merchants. Arm rings held particular significance because they symbolized loyalty, wealth, and political bonds. Chieftains sometimes rewarded followers with silver arm rings during ceremonies or alliances. Essentially, Viking leadership occasionally resembled extremely aggressive friendship bracelets. Silver dominated much of Viking jewelry because it flowed into Scandinavia through trade routes connecting the Norse world with the Islamic caliphates in Eastern Europe. Archaeologists have discovered enormous hoards of silver coins, ingots, and cut fragments buried across Viking territories. Some jewellery was even chopped into pieces and weighed during transactions. Fashion and finance became strangely intertwined. Amber beads from the Baltic region remained popular as well, alongside glass beads imported from distant workshops. Wealthier women often wore colourful bead necklaces suspended between brooches across the chest. These decorations announced status immediately inside Viking communities. Jewellery also carried religious meaning. Pendants shaped like Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, became especially common during the later Viking Age, partly as symbols of Norse identity during the spread of Christianity. Crosses also appeared increasingly over time as religious influences mixed across Scandinavia. Even grooming tools became decorative. Combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, and small knives were often suspended from belts or necklaces inside carefully crafted cases, because apparently, Vikings believed one should remain prepared for both battle and unexpected personal maintenance at all times. And honestly, considering how much silver they carried around, they probably wanted to look reasonably presentable while doing it. For people remembered mainly as axe-wielding raiders arriving suddenly from the sea, Vikings were surprisingly concerned with personal hygiene. In fact, by medieval standards, they were almost suspiciously clean. This came as a shock to many of the people they encountered across Europe. Several foreign observers commented on how often Vikings bathed, groomed themselves, and maintained their appearance. According to some accounts from England, Norsemen even gained reputations for attracting local women because they washed regularly, combed their hair, and changed clothes more frequently than many of their medieval neighbours, which must have been deeply irritating for the monks trying to describe them as savage heathens. Archaeological discoveries support this image strongly. Viking settlements regularly produced grooming tools such as combs, tweezers, razors, ear cleaners, nail picks, and small mirrors. Many of these items were carefully crafted from bone, antler, or metal, and carried in personal cases attached to belts. The Vikings apparently approached hygiene with the seriousness of people who understood that spending months trapped on ships beside unwashed companions could easily become a form of psychological warfare. Hair mattered enormously in Viking society. Men commonly wore their hair long or medium length, often with carefully maintained beards or moustaches. Hairstyles varied by region and status, but grooming clearly remained important. Combs appear so frequently in Viking archaeological sites that historians sometimes joke they were among the most essential objects in Scandinavian daily life. Frankly, if your culture spends half its existence battling freezing winds, sea salt, and smoke-filled halls, managing your hair probably becomes a survival skill. Women also maintained complex hairstyles involving braids, knots, ribbons, and decorative pins. Hair signaled status, age, and sometimes marital identity. Long, well-kept hair represented beauty and social respectability throughout much of the Norse world. Bathing itself happened more often than many modern stereotypes suggest. The Old Norse language even had a specific day associated with bathing and washing. Hot springs, steam baths, wooden tubs, and saunas existed across Scandinavia. Clean clothing and regular washing were seen as signs of dignity and civilized behavior. This means the average Viking probably smelled significantly better than many medieval nobles elsewhere in Europe. History can be cruelly ironic sometimes. Clothing maintenance formed part of this cleanliness as well. Garments were brushed, repaired, aired out, and protected carefully because producing textiles required immense labour. Wealthier Vikings could display especially fine grooming through neatly trimmed beards, decorative hairstyles, clean tunics, and polished jewellery. Appearance carried social meaning. A sloppy warrior might appear lazy, poor, or unreliable. A well-groomed man projected discipline, wealth, and status before ever speaking. Even in harsh northern societies built around survival, people still judged each other constantly through appearance. Because no civilization in human history has ever truly escaped the sentence. Everyone immediately noticed how terrible he looked. Despite what modern movies often suggest, Vikings did not spend every waking moment marching into battle dramatically covered in leather straps and unnecessary fur. Most of the time they dressed for work, travel and survival. But when war came, clothing changed quickly. A Viking preparing for battle still wore many of the same basic garments used in ordinary life. Wool tunics, trousers, leg wraps, leather shoes and cloaks. The difference came through layers of protection added on top. Real Viking warfare depended heavily on mobility, endurance and practical equipment, rather than fantasy-style armor weighing as much as a horse. And frankly, anyone trying to row a longship across the North Sea while dressed like a metal wardrobe would not last very long. Most ordinary warriors owned little armor at all. Good armor was expensive and required enormous skill to produce. Wealthier chieftains and elite fighters could afford chainmail shirts, iron helmets, and better weapons. But many Vikings fought wearing only thick wool clothing reinforced with shields and courage, which history repeatedly demonstrates is not ideal, but surprisingly common. Chainmail represented one of the most valuable possessions a warrior could own. Thousands of tiny iron rings had to be linked together by hand, creating flexible armor capable of absorbing cuts and reducing injuries. A well-made mail shirt could take months to produce and cost a fortune. Such armor was often passed down through generations as treasured family property. Helmets were simpler than modern depictions. Real Viking helmets were practical iron caps designed to protect the skull without excessive decoration. No horns, no giant wings, no theatrical nonsense designed to accidentally snag on tree branches during combat. The famous horned Viking image mostly emerged centuries later through art and opera, because apparently humans eventually looked at practical Scandinavian warriors and decided they needed more livestock attached to their heads. Sea travel shaped Viking clothing heavily as well. Sailors crossing icy waters needed garments layered carefully against freezing winds and constant moisture. Thick cloaks, wool caps, mittens and tightly wrapped clothing protected crews during long voyages toward England, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland and beyond. Waterproofing remained primitive, so survival depended largely on layering and durable materials. Wet wool still provided warmth better than many alternatives, making it invaluable aboard ships. Sailors likely smelled permanently of smoke, salt water, fish and damp sheep, a deeply authentic Viking fragrance line. Battle also changed appearance symbolically. Wealthier warriors decorated weapons, belts, scabbards and helmets with silver, bronze or carved designs displaying status and reputation. A famous fighter wanted to be recognized immediately on the battlefield, because intimidation mattered almost as much as combat skill itself. Yet even at war, Viking clothing remained grounded in practicality. These were sailors, traders, farmers and explorers living in one of Europe's harshest climates. Their clothing needed to function first and impress second, though ideally it accomplished both simultaneously. For a society often imagined as isolated northern raiders living beside frozen fjords, the Vikings were remarkably connected to the wider world, and their clothing reflected it constantly. By the height of the Viking Age, Scandinavian traders travelled across rivers into Eastern Europe, sailed into the Byzantine Empire, reached the Islamic Caliphates, and traded through markets stretching far beyond northern Europe. Along the way, they encountered foreign fabrics, dyes, jewellery, and luxury goods, unlike anything produced in Scandinavia itself. Naturally, they began bringing those luxuries home. Silk became especially prized among wealthy Vikings. Imported silk fragments from Byzantium, Persia, and the Islamic world have been discovered in Scandinavian graves and settlements, proving that elite Norse families wore exotic fabrics obtained through long-distance trade. Silk trims decorated cloaks, tunics, and ceremonial clothing, especially among the wealthy. Imagine living in a cold wooden hall in Norway, while casually wearing fabric that travelled thousands of miles from the east. That was the medieval equivalent of arriving at dinner in a private jet. Foreign dyes also transformed Viking fashion. Bright blues, deep reds and rich greens became symbols of status because producing strong colours required expensive materials and skilled craftsmanship. Wealthier Vikings displayed imported fabrics and decorative embroidery proudly during feasts and gatherings, because humans have never once looked at rare luxury items and thought, I should probably keep this quiet. The city of Birka became one of the great trading centres of the Viking world, filled with merchants exchanging furs, silver, amber, slaves, weapons, glassware, and textiles from across Europe and Asia. Archaeologists there have uncovered evidence of astonishing cultural exchange woven directly into clothing styles and decorative patterns. Some Viking garments even incorporated Arabic-inspired designs or Eastern weaving techniques. Silver coins from the Islamic world flowed northward into Scandinavia in enormous numbers, often melted down into jewellery and ornamentation. Viking fashion became increasingly international, without losing its distinct northern identity. Foreign influence also changed elite appearance politically. A powerful chieftain wearing imported silk, fine brooches, and exotic jewellery announced more than simple wealth. He demonstrated access to trade networks spanning continents. His clothing silently declared connections, influence, and prestige far beyond local villages. Even hairstyles and grooming may have absorbed foreign influences through travel and contact. Vikings serving as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire, especially within the famous Varangian Guard, likely returned home with new tastes in fashion, weapons, and luxury goods. The Viking world was not culturally isolated at all. It was deeply entangled with the medieval global economy, and somewhere inside a smoky Scandinavian longhouse, a wealthy Norse trader probably sat proudly wearing imported Byzantine silk, while pretending he had not spent an absurd amount of silver acquiring it. By the end of the Viking Age, Norse clothing had become the product of centuries of survival, trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange. Yet strangely, most modern people still imagine Vikings dressed like furious fantasy barbarians who lost a fight with a costume department. The real Vikings were far more interesting than the myth. They were farmers wrapped in layered wool against freezing winds, sailors repairing damp cloaks beside smoky fires after weeks at sea, merchants wearing imported silk trims from Byzantium while bargaining in crowded ports, women fastening carefully woven dresses with elegant brooches passed down through generations, warriors maintaining polished weapons and neatly groomed beards because appearance mattered deeply in Norse society. The Viking world valued practicality, but it also valued presentation. Clothing revealed wealth, status, regional identity, trade connections, and personal reputation. A skilled weaver, a richly dyed cloak, or a finely crafted brooch could speak just as loudly about a family's standing as land or livestock. Even grooming became part of social identity. Hair, jewellery, belts, shoes, and fabrics all communicated something about the wearer before a single word was spoken, because humans have always judged each other visually first and philosophically later. The reality of Viking fashion also reveals how connected Scandinavia truly was to the wider medieval world. Silk from the east, silver from the Islamic caliphates, glass beads from distant workshops, and foreign textile styles all reached northern settlements through vast trade networks. Vikings were not isolated tribes trapped at the edge of Europe. They were active participants in a surprisingly globalized medieval economy. Even their famous practicality shaped later history. Layered cold-weather clothing, durable leather shoes, wool cloaks, and adaptable travel garments were designed for real environments rather than dramatic storytelling. These people crossed oceans in open ships, survived brutal winters, founded settlements across the North Atlantic, and traded from Baghdad to Newfoundland. Frankly, they had more urgent concerns than attaching decorative horns to helmets. The modern image of Vikings emerged much later through romantic art, 19th century nationalism, opera costumes, and fantasy fiction. Over time, the real Scandinavian world of weaving, farming, grooming, repairing clothes, and surviving harsh climates transformed into a simplified image of endless battle and animal fur. History tends to do that. It turns complicated humans into symbols, but the archaeological evidence tells a quieter story. Combs buried beside warriors, carefully repaired shoes, fine silk fragments in graves, dyed wool cloaks woven with extraordinary skill, decorative brooches polished through years of wear. These discoveries reveal people who cared deeply about appearance, comfort, craftsmanship, and status. Not because they were vain, because clothing was survival, identity, and reputation stitched together. And somewhere in medieval Scandinavia, An actual Viking probably looked at modern depictions of his people and thought the same thing many historians quietly think today. Why are they all wearing so much unnecessary leather? For the ancient Illyrians, spring was not just a pleasant change in weather. It was relief, real relief. The kind felt deep in the bones after surviving months of freezing winds, muddy paths, weak sunlight, hungry animals, and smoke-filled houses where entire families spent winter crowded beside hearth fires trying not to freeze to death before the goats did. Across the Western Balkans, the Illyrian tribes lived in a rugged world of mountains, forests, rocky valleys, and coastal settlements, stretching through regions of modern Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia, Croatia, and nearby lands. Winter could isolate villages completely. Snow blocked mountain paths, food stores shrank dangerously low, livestock weakened, fishing and travel became difficult. By the final weeks of winter, everyone was exhausted, which explains why spring celebrations carried such emotional power. As the first warmer winds moved across the hills, the landscape slowly transformed. Snow melted along the mountain slopes, rivers swelled with fresh water rushing toward the Adriatic Sea, trees regained colour, wildflowers appeared beside old stone paths. Shepherds led sheep and goats back into open pastures, while farmers prepared fields for planting once again. The world itself seemed to wake up, and naturally, the Illyrians celebrated this survival loudly. Villages gathered outdoors for communal feasts, rituals, music, and seasonal ceremonies tied to fertility, renewal, livestock, and the return of life. Much of Illyrian religion remains mysterious today because they left behind limited written records, but archaeological evidence and later regional traditions suggest spring held enormous spiritual importance. After all, when your survival depends directly on weather and harvests, the arrival of spring stops feeling symbolic very quickly. It becomes the difference between prosperity and starvation. Fires often played a central role in these seasonal gatherings. Bonfires lit across hillsides may have symbolized purification, protection, or the return of the sun's strength after winter darkness. Families and clans gathered around flames, singing, drinking, eating roasted meat, and offering thanks to local gods, spirits, or ancestral forces tied to nature itself. Young people likely played an especially visible role during these festivals. Spring marked the season of courtship, marriages, fertility, and new beginnings. Dancing, games, music, and public gatherings created opportunities for alliances, romances, and social bonding between clans. Which sounds poetic until you remember ancient villages also meant your entire extended family watching every interaction from 3 meters away. Still, beneath the celebration stood something deeply human. The Illyrians were celebrating endurance. Winter had passed. The animals survived. The food held out. The tribe remained together, and for one brief moment beneath the warming Balkan sky, life felt possible again. As spring spread across the Illyrian lands, fire began appearing across the hills. Not the terrifying kind signalling raids or war, the comforting kind announcing that winter had finally lost the argument. Throughout the Balkans, seasonal bonfires were deeply connected to ancient ritual life, and the Illyrians were almost certainly no exception. For people living close to forests, mountains, storms, and unpredictable harvests, fire carried enormous symbolic power. It gave warmth, protection, light, and survival during the darkest months of the year. So when spring arrived, the flames returned to the open air. Villages gathered at night on hilltops, clearings, or sacred communal spaces where enormous fires were prepared using dry wood collected over previous days. As darkness settled over the valleys, the flames could reportedly be seen from neighbouring settlements far away across the mountains. Imagine entire hillsides glowing with fire beneath the cold spring sky, while drums echoed through the distance. Honestly, even modern people would immediately think something important was happening. These fires likely served several purposes at once. Spiritually, they may have symbolized purification after winter, or the strengthening return of the sun. Agriculturally, they mark the beginning of planting season and the hope for fertile land, healthy animals, and protection against disease or disaster. because ancient farming communities were fully aware that nature could ruin their lives at any moment. Some later Balkan folk traditions, which may preserve echoes of older Illyrian customs, involved jumping over small ritual fires for cleansing, luck, fertility, or protection. Young men especially probably treated this as an opportunity to demonstrate bravery, athleticism, and questionable decision-making in front of the village. Human history strongly suggests that if young men see a ceremonial fire, somebody will eventually attempt something unnecessary near it. Music and dancing accompanied many of these celebrations. Flutes, drums, and rhythmic chanting likely echoed around the fires while people moved in circles or communal dances. The celebrations were not silent religious ceremonies filled with quiet reflection. They were loud. People drank wine or fermented beverages, shared roasted meat, exchanged stories, and welcomed relatives from nearby settlements. Spring festivals strengthened bonds between clans after long, isolated winters. News spread during these gatherings. Marriages were discussed, alliances renewed. Old feuds occasionally reopened after too much drinking. Some traditions never disappear completely. The fires themselves probably burned late into the night. Children watched sparks rise into the darkness, while elders told stories about gods, ancestors, spirits of the mountains, or past tribal heroes. Around the flames, memory and ritual mixed together. And somewhere beyond the firelight, the forests of the Balkans remained dark and ancient, watching generations of Illyrians celebrate the same returning spring year after year. Because long before written history reached these mountains, the fires were already burning there. Once the fires were lit and the food prepared, the celebrations truly began. And the Illyrians were almost certainly not quiet about it. Spring festivals across the ancient Balkans were communal events meant to pull entire villages out of the long silence of winter. After months spent indoors beside smoky hearths, listening mainly to wind, rain, coughing relatives, and deeply unhappy livestock, people suddenly gathered outdoors again beneath open skies. Naturally, music followed immediately. Although very little written evidence survives describing Illyrian music directly, archaeological discoveries and regional traditions suggest they used flutes, drums, horns, and stringed instruments during ceremonies and communal gatherings. Music was woven into every important moment of life: war, feasts, funerals, weddings, and seasonal festivals. Spring celebrations especially demanded sound. Drums echoed through valleys while wooden flutes carried melodies across the hillsides. Horns announced the beginning of rituals or gatherings between clans. Rhythmic singing and chanting likely accompanied communal dances around fires and open spaces near villages. And once enough wine entered the situation, the dancing probably became increasingly ambitious. Circle dances may have played an important role during these festivals, much like many traditional Balkan dances that survived into later centuries. Men and women moved together rhythmically while musicians maintained repetitive melodies designed to last for hours. Dancing was not simply entertainment. It reinforced unity, courtship, social identity, and collective memory. A village dancing together survived together. Young people especially became the center of attention during these gatherings. Spring marked fertility, growth, and new beginnings, making it one of the most important seasons for courtship and marriage arrangements. Young men attempted to impress through dancing, singing, athletic games, or displays of strength. Young women wore carefully prepared clothing, jewelry, and floral decorations during communal celebrations. Meanwhile, older relatives observed everything with the terrifying awareness of people already planning future marriage negotiations. Songs likely celebrated nature, heroic ancestors, tribal victories, livestock, and returning abundance after winter hardship. Oral storytelling formed the backbone of Illyrian cultural memory, meaning many spring songs probably carried fragments of history and mythology passed down across generations. Because before books existed widely, entire cultures survived through repetition beside fires. Alcohol also flowed freely during these festivals. Wine reached Illyrian regions through trade with Greek colonies and Mediterranean merchants, while local fermented drinks likely appeared as well. Shared drinking strengthened social bonds, loosened tensions between clans, and occasionally created the sort of arguments ancient communities politely referred to as unfortunate incidents involving spears. Civilization has always balanced very carefully between music and disaster. Yet beneath the noise, laughter, and celebration stood something deeply emotional. For one brief season, winter no longer controlled the world. The earth felt alive again. The villages filled with sound again. And across the mountains of the Balkans, the Illyrians danced beneath the returning stars, as though life itself had been given back to them. As spring deepened across the Illyrian lands, the celebrations became filled with symbols taken directly from the waking landscape itself. Flowers appeared everywhere. Fresh green branches decorated homes, gathering places, gates, and sacred spaces. Young women braided flowers into their hair, while children carried woven wreaths through villages still smelling faintly of winter smoke and damp earth. Nature itself became part of the celebration, because for agricultural societies, spring was not abstract poetry. It was proof the world had decided not to kill everyone this year. Although the Illyrians left behind few written descriptions of their seasonal customs, many later Balkan traditions strongly suggest ancient roots tied to fertility rituals and the symbolic rebirth of nature. Green plants represented life returning after winter's death-like stillness. Blossoming trees signaled fertility for crops, animals, and people alike. And ancient societies took fertility extremely seriously. A failed harvest meant hunger. Sick livestock meant disaster. Declining birth rates threatened the future of the tribe itself. So spring rituals focused heavily on encouraging abundance in every form possible. Young branches and flowers may have been carried in processions around settlements or placed near fields and animal pens for protection and blessing. Certain plants likely held sacred meanings connected to local gods, spirits, rivers, or mountain forces worshipped by Illyrian tribes. The forests surrounding the Balkans were not viewed as empty wilderness. They were alive with spiritual presence. Sacred groves probably played an important role during seasonal ceremonies. Trees themselves carried symbolic power across many ancient European cultures, and the Illyrians likely shared similar beliefs. Large old trees, springs, hilltops, and unusual stones may have served as ritual gathering places during spring festivals. Meanwhile, women likely held especially important ceremonial roles connected to fertility and renewal. In many ancient societies, spring rituals centered heavily around feminine symbolism, motherhood, growth, harvest, and the continuation of life. Songs, dances, and offerings may have honored both nature and ancestral traditions carried through generations of women within the tribe. At the same time, young men participated through athletic games, horse displays, hunting contests, or demonstrations of strength tied to courtship and social status. Because no ancient festival in human history ever remained completely free from competitive male behavior for very long. Garlands and floral decorations probably also served practical social purposes. A person arriving at the festival well-dressed and decorated announced health, prosperity, and family stability. Appearance mattered during communal gatherings where marriages, alliances, and reputations quietly formed beneath the celebrations. Even the villages themselves transformed visually. After the grey hardship of winter, settlements suddenly filled with green branches, fresh clothing, flowers, music, and movement. Smoke rose beside blooming hillsides while rivers carried melted snow down from the mountains. And everywhere around them, the Illyrians saw the same message written across the land. Life had returned once again. No Illyrian spring celebration would have felt complete without food. Large amounts of food, after surviving a long Balkan winter on stored grain, dried meat, cheese, onions, and whatever livestock had not died from cold or hunger, the arrival of spring finally allowed villages to gather outdoors and eat together again in abundance. And humans throughout history have always responded to survival with the exact same sentence: we should absolutely roast something immediately. Communal feasting stood at the center of seasonal life among ancient Illyrian tribes. Families from nearby settlements traveled into shared gathering spaces carrying bread, wine, cheese, smoked meat, olives, herbs, and early spring vegetables. Livestock may have been sacrificed during ritual ceremonies before being prepared for enormous communal meals around the fires. These feasts were not quiet or orderly. Children ran between groups of adults. Dogs circled constantly beneath the tables hunting scraps. Smoke from roasting meat drifted across the hillsides while musicians played nearby, and elders argued over stories from winters long past. Some things never change across centuries. Sheep and goats likely formed an important part of these gatherings because pastoral life played such a major role in Illyrian society. Roasted lamb especially may have carried symbolic meaning tied to fertility, renewal, and seasonal abundance. Bread baked from stored grain appeared beside soft cheeses, wild herbs, honey, nuts, and wine traded through Adriatic coastal networks. Wine mattered greatly during these festivals. Greek colonies along the Adriatic coast had traded wine into Illyrian territories for centuries, and many tribal elites embraced Mediterranean drinking culture enthusiastically. Feasting and drinking became ways of displaying hospitality, status, and tribal unity. A powerful leader demonstrated influence by feeding large numbers of people publicly. Politics and dinner have always maintained a suspiciously close relationship. Spring feasts also reinforced survival itself. Villages that endured winter successfully could celebrate openly. Families displayed healthy livestock, preserved food stores, and growing prosperity after difficult months. Sharing food strengthened communal bonds between clans that depended heavily on cooperation during harsh seasons. At the same time, these gatherings became opportunities for negotiation. Marriage agreements were discussed quietly between families. Tribal alliances renewed beside shared meals. Disputes settled, or occasionally worsened, after enough drinking. Young warriors tried impressing others through hunting stories or exaggerated accounts of bravery that became increasingly unrealistic with every cup of wine. Meanwhile, older relatives listened with the exhausted patience of people who had already heard these stories 7 times before. Yet beneath all the noise and celebration stood something deeply emotional. For one evening, the fear of winter disappeared. The food was plentiful, the fires were warm, the tribe remained alive together beneath the open spring sky. And somewhere beyond the feast, the fields waited for planting while the mountains slowly turned green once again. As the fires burned lower and the music continued into the night, the spring celebrations took on another important role: finding husbands, finding wives, finding trouble, preferably not all 3 at the same time. For the Illyrians, spring was deeply connected to fertility and renewal, which meant seasonal gatherings naturally became one of the most important moments for courtship between clans and villages. During winter, isolated settlements hidden among mountains and valleys saw relatively few outsiders. But spring festivals suddenly brought entire communities together again, beneath open skies filled with music, feasting, and enough wine to encourage extremely confident decisions. Young people waited for these gatherings eagerly. Clothing mattered enormously during these celebrations. Young women wore carefully woven dresses, jewelry, bronze bracelets, decorated belts, and floral wreaths placed into braided hair. Young men cleaned weapons, groomed themselves, and displayed embroidered cloaks, horse gear, or signs of family wealth whenever possible. Because even in the ancient Balkans, humans understood one universal truth. People suddenly become much more attractive near bonfires and music. Dancing created opportunities for interaction that daily life rarely allowed. Circle dances, songs, games, and communal rituals placed young men and women together, publicly beneath the supervision of relatives who were pretending not to supervise them constantly. Ancient parents possessed extraordinary talent for casually monitoring courtship from a distance of 3 meters while holding bread. Marriage among Illyrian tribes was not merely personal romance. It strengthened alliances, expanded family influence, secured peace between clans, and protected tribal stability. A successful marriage could unite neighboring communities or reinforce existing loyalties during uncertain times, which placed slightly more pressure on introductions than modern dating applications. Young warriors especially tried to prove themselves during spring gatherings through athletic contests, horse riding, hunting skill, music, or storytelling. Physical strength and bravery mattered greatly within Illyrian culture, but generosity and family reputation mattered too. A respected household with healthy livestock and stable alliances appeared far more desirable than a reckless fighter who spent most of his life creating enemies. Though history strongly suggests reckless fighters still remained frustratingly popular, women likely held considerable influence within these social gatherings as well. Ancient Balkan traditions often preserved strong communal roles for women during seasonal ceremonies tied to fertility, household continuity, and family honor. Songs and rituals connected directly to spring may have emphasized feminine symbolism tied to growth and renewal. As darkness deepened, smaller conversations formed at the edges of the celebrations. Families discussed possible matches quietly, while young people exchanged glances beside the fires. Music drifted through the night air while somewhere nearby, older tribal elders pretended not to notice any of it happening, even though they absolutely noticed everything. Because beneath the laughter and dancing, everyone understood the deeper truth of spring. The future of the tribe itself was being built there beneath the returning stars. Beneath the music, feasting and celebration, the Illyrian spring festivals carried something older and more serious. Ritual. The Illyrians lived in a world where nature was not separate from spiritual life. Mountains, rivers, forests, caves, storms and springs all carried sacred meaning. The landscape surrounding the tribes was alive with unseen forces that could protect, punish, nourish, or destroy entire communities, depending on their favor. And after surviving winter, people were highly motivated to remain on good terms with those forces. Although much of Illyrian religion remains mysterious today due to limited written records, archaeological evidence and later regional traditions strongly suggest the existence of local gods tied closely to fertility, water, war, the sun, livestock, and natural cycles. Spring celebrations likely included offerings meant to secure protection and abundance for the coming year. Because ancient farming societies understood a terrifying truth modern people occasionally forget. Nature always wins eventually. Sacred springs probably played a particularly important role during these ceremonies. Across the Balkans, water sources were often treated as holy places connected to healing, fertility, and divine presence. During spring festivals, people may have left offerings near rivers, wells, or mountain springs in hopes of healthy crops, strong livestock, and protection from disease. Coins, jewelry, food, wine, animal sacrifices, or crafted objects could all be given symbolically to the gods or ancestral spirits. And honestly, if your survival depended entirely on weather patterns you barely understood, tossing a few offerings into a sacred river probably felt like a reasonable investment. Mountains themselves carried enormous spiritual importance in Illyrian territory. Towering peaks dominated daily life across the Western Balkans, shaping weather, travel, warfare, and tribal identity. Certain high places may have served as sacred gathering points, where rituals connected communities directly to the divine world above them. Bonfires lit on hillsides likely strengthened this symbolism further. Fire rising into the night sky beside mountain peaks created a visible connection between earth, people, and the heavens themselves. The rituals were probably communal rather than silent or isolated. Priests, tribal elders, or respected spiritual figures may have led prayers, chants, sacrifices, or ceremonial processions, while the wider community gathered nearby. Music and ritual likely blended together seamlessly during these celebrations, because ancient religion rarely separated spirituality from everyday social life. Everything existed together: food, gods, family, fire, dancing, ancestors, and survival. Animal sacrifice may also have formed part of these spring ceremonies. Livestock held immense value, so offering an animal publicly demonstrated both devotion and communal wealth. The sacrificed animal often became part of the shared feast afterward, connecting ritual directly with celebration. Nothing was wasted in the ancient Balkans, and as smoke from fires and offerings rose into the cold spring air, the Illyrians likely believed they were doing something essential, reminding the gods that their people were still here, still alive, and ready once again for another year beneath the mountains. As the spring celebrations reached their height, the mood often shifted from ritual and feasting towards something far louder and more competitive, because eventually, every large gathering of ancient tribal warriors becomes a contest, whether anyone planned it or not. For the Illyrians, public games and displays of skill likely formed an important part of seasonal festivals. These were not organized sporting events in the modern sense, with neat rules, polite applause, and deeply overpriced snacks. They were communal demonstrations of strength, endurance, horsemanship, hunting ability, and tribal pride, and probably at least one completely unnecessary injury. The Illyrian tribes were famous throughout the ancient world for their warrior culture and exceptional knowledge of mountainous terrain. Greek and Roman writers frequently described them as fierce fighters, skilled riders, and stubborn opponents who knew how to survive in harsh landscapes. Spring festivals gave young men opportunities to prove themselves publicly before elders, rival clans, and potential marriage partners, which dramatically increased the level of recklessness involved. Horse competitions were likely among the most admired displays during these gatherings. Horses carried enormous value in Illyrian society, especially among tribal elites and warriors. Riders demonstrated speed, control, and bravery across open fields or rough hillsides, while crowds watched from nearby fires and feast areas. A skilled rider did not simply entertain people. He displayed wealth, military usefulness, and social status all at once. Athletic contests may have included wrestling, running, spear throwing, archery, mock combat, or hunting demonstrations tied to warrior training. Victories brought prestige not only to individuals but also to their families and clans. Reputation mattered deeply in tribal societies, where memory travelled orally across generations, meaning one successful competition could become a story retold for decades, and one humiliating failure absolutely would too. Music and shouting accompanied many of these events. Crowds encouraged competitors loudly, while older warriors criticised techniques with the confidence unique to people no longer required to participate themselves. Ancient spectators were apparently very similar to modern sports fans. The competitions also strengthened unity between tribes that might otherwise spend much of the year isolated or suspicious of one another. Shared games created temporary peace, reinforced alliances, and allowed rival groups to compete symbolically without immediately reaching for weapons. Though occasionally they still reached for weapons anyway. Spring festivals balanced carefully between celebration and tension, because large gatherings always carried political importance. Chieftains watched ambitious young warriors closely. Families evaluated potential alliances. Rivals measured each other's strength beneath the appearance of friendly competition. Yet beneath all the noise stood genuine joy as well. After surviving another winter, people gathered beneath the warm Balkan sky to run, race, laugh, sing, and test themselves openly before the community. Children chased each other near the fields, while horses thundered across the hillsides and drums echoed through the valleys. For a brief moment, the entire tribe felt alive again together. As the final night of the celebrations settled across the Illyrian lands, the fires began to burn lower. The loudest songs softened into quieter melodies. The dancing slowed. Smoke drifted upward into the cold mountain air, while exhausted children slept beside cloaks and woven baskets near the edges of the gathering. And slowly, people began thinking about the year ahead. Because for the Illyrians, spring celebrations were never simply about enjoying themselves. They were about preparing emotionally and spiritually for survival once again. The planting season waited beyond the festival. Shepherds would soon guide flocks high into the mountains. Fishermen would return to the rivers and Adriatic coastlines. Warriors might leave for raids, trade journeys, or tribal conflicts before summer fully arrived. Women would oversee households, weaving, food preparation, and family life through the long working months ahead. The celebration stood at the border between hardship and hope. Around the final fires, elders told stories beneath the stars while younger generations listened carefully. Tales of ancestors, tribal heroes, old battles, sacred mountains and winters, long survived passed from one generation to the next through memory alone. Because long before books became common in the Balkans, history lived inside human voices. The final communal meals carried emotional weight as well. Families who had spent winter isolated in distant valleys prepared to separate again. Alliances renewed during the festivals would now be tested by real life. Marriages discussed beside the fires would shape future generations of the tribe. Even the laughter during the last night probably felt different, quieter, more reflective. Ancient people understood uncertainty intimately. A single drought, disease, storm, or failed harvest could destroy entire communities. The joy of spring existed partly because everyone knew how fragile life truly was beneath the mountains, and yet they celebrated anyway,